Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. We're finishing out a series here on the doctrine of the resurrection. Scripture teaches that there's going to be a general resurrection where all are going to be raised from the dead. But how exactly is that going to work? It seems like some people go out of existence, and there's lots of difficulties facing this doctrine, and we're going to get into that. But this particular model is one that I'm probably most inclined toward, and it's the resurrection by reassembly model to explain, how can all these people be raised from the dead? And my guest defending this view, or at least, he published in defense of the view, is Dr. Justin Mooney. He recently received his PhD, so I can call him doctor now. So good to have you on, Dr. Justin Mooney.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks. I'm excited to be back talking about resurrection.
Yes, it is an appropriate time given that Easter just was a few weeks ago. So, okay, let's start by talking about just what you mean by resurrection in general, and then we'll get into some of the problems.
Yeah, okay. So I don't have an analysis of the concept of resurrection to give you, but here's what I think is an important necessary condition on something's being a resurrection. You have to have an organism. Could be like a human or some other like non-human animal or something like that. And that organism has to die in the ordinary biological sense of death, not like some spiritual sense or metaphorical sense. And then at some point causally downstream of that death, that same organism has to start living again in the ordinary biological sense of life. That I think is a necessary condition, or at least it's a plausible necessary condition on something's being a resurrection. It's probably not sufficient because it's not clear to me that it distinguishes resurrection from reincarnation. But for purposes of tonight, I don't think we're going to need to figure out what the difference is exactly between resurrection and reincarnation. So we're just going to work with that. But also, the paper that we're talking about tonight, I have a certain doctrine in view, and it's the doctrine that you just mentioned. That it's a doctrine in traditional Christian theology of the general resurrection of the dead. And what this doctrine says is that just like Jesus was resurrected from the dead, so at a certain point in the future, everybody who has died is going to be resurrected. And also, my understanding is that it's a part of this doctrine as it's like traditionally understood. And this is how I read 1 Corinthians 15 as well. I think it's definitely what Paul is saying, that the resurrection body that a person is raised with is numerically identical to, but qualitatively different from the pre-mortem body. So here's what that means. It means it's the same individual body that you had before you died, but it has some different features than it had before. So, for example, it's an immortal, glorified body instead of the mortal bodies that we have now. Okay, so it's the same individual thing, but it has changed, in certain ways. Okay, so that's the traditional doctrine of the general resurrection in Christian theology.
Very good. Now, there is a philosopher whose last name is Olson. Can't remember his first name.
Eric.
Okay. And he presents a dilemma for the doctrine of this what we mean by resurrection. So what's the dilemma?
Yeah, okay. So let's start here. It seems to me that any adherent of the traditional doctrine of the general resurrection is going to be committed to the view that a whole bunch of composite material objects that seem to have ceased existing completely are going to be back again at some point in the future. And there's a couple of different ways that an adherent of the traditional doctrine might be committed to this. So some adherents of resurrection think that a human person is a material object. They might say that, you are a body, or you're a part of a body like a brain, or you're an object that's constituted by a body, and so on. And it kind of seems like, by the time a person has died and their body has completely decomposed, it seems like any material object that's a plausible candidate for being a person has, by that point, stopped existing. It's gone. And yet, according to the doctrine of resurrection, the very same person who dies is going to be back again and resurrected at a certain point in the future. So if you think that a human person is a material object, and you're an adherent of this doctrine, you end up with this position that, okay, a whole bunch of material objects that seem to be completely gone are going to be back later. Now, some Christians think, well, actually, a human person is not a material object. A human person is like an immaterial soul, or at least has like a part that is an immaterial soul. And on that view, it doesn't seem right to say that, you appear to stop existing when you die, because souls, nothing really is apparent about souls, I guess. But if you hold to the traditional view that it's numerically the same body that is resurrected, then even someone who thinks that a human person is not a material object still has a version of this problem. Like, well, all these bodies seem to have stopped existing, and yet they're somehow going to be back again later. Okay, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to assume going forward that a human person is a material object. I'm not sure that I actually believe that. I kind of waver between those two views. But just to keep things simple, let's just pick that view and stick with it and just talk in terms of that view. Now, here's Olson's dilemma. Olson says, look, if you're going to say that somehow the doctrine of resurrection is true, you got two options. You either are going to say that these material people don't or haven't stopped existing, even though it sure looks like they have, the ones who have died. Or you have to say, yes, they have stopped existing, but nevertheless, they can come back again. It's possible for them to start existing again after they've completely gone. And the problem is that there are difficulties with both of these options. So Olson calls the first option preservation. And the difficulty with preservation is just, one difficulty with it is it really looks false. Like, it sure looks like, my body and my brain and anything else in the vicinity is just gone by the time decomposition is done. It is destroyed. It doesn't look like it's survived somehow. And then the difficulty with the other option, which Olson calls radical resurrection, or at any rate, the main difficulty with it, is that a lot of people have the intuition that you just can't bring the very same object back again once it has completely decomposed. At least if we're talking about a human person. A lot of people have the intuition that the best that you could do, or even the best that God could do, would be to create a duplicate of that person, like a copy. But it's like metaphysically impossible for it to be the very same person. Some people have that intuition, and there's at least one explanation in the literature as to like why that might be true. Well, actually, there are a few, I think. There's one that I think is probably the right one, but we'll get into that a little bit more later, I think. So, but anyway, that's the initial problem.
Okay, so we've laid out what resurrection is. You presented Olson's dilemma. Now, just to be clear, which horn of that dilemma does the resurrection by reassembly model face?
Yeah, so the reassembly model embraces the radical resurrection horn and says, yep, even though a lot of people have completely ceased to exist, it's possible for them to come back into existence later. And then should I explain at this point?
Yeah, now's a good time to say, and this is what resurrection by reassembly is.
Yeah, good. Okay. So here's the reassembly model and what it says. So there's an analogy that's sometimes used for this model that involves a pocket watch. And conveniently, I actually have a pocket watch. Here it is. It has this cool little like button where it'll just like pop open, and it has my name engraved on it. So I got this as a gift when I was in somebody's wedding. I was like one of the groomsmen. Actually, I was the best man for this wedding. Anyway, and I got this pocket watch as a gift. And so let's imagine the following situation. Suppose this watch stops working. And so I take it to a watchmaker to get it fixed. And then suppose the watchmaker takes it and disassembles it so that we no longer have a watch, we just have like a pile of parts. And then the watchmaker, tinkers with the parts or something. And then when he's done, he puts those parts back together again, just the way they were before, so that we now have a watch again and not just a pile of parts. And then he hands it back to me. Okay. It's controversial what exactly is going on in that situation, but here's one view that some people defend, and it's also the view that I defend, actually. One view of what's going on there is that when the watch was disassembled, it stopped existing. And then when the parts were put back together again, the watch came back into existence. And it's not just that a watch started to exist, but the original watch, my watch, the one I got at that wedding, came back into existence. And so when the watchmaker hands it back to me, I got my original watch back and not just like a copy of it. Okay. So the reassembly model of resurrection basically says that resurrection works just like that watch case. What happens is that when a person dies and decomposes, all that's left of them is a whole bunch of particles that used to compose the person, but they stopped existing when they died and or decomposed. Somewhere in that process, stopped existing. But you can bring that person back again, or at any rate, God can, by just taking all of those particles and putting them back together the way that they were when they composed the deceased person. And just like putting the watch parts together brought back the very same original watch, putting those particles back together brings back the original person. That's the idea of the reassembly model. It's really actually very simple in a way. But yeah, that's the core idea right there.
So this is the fourth interview I've done on this topic. The others, one gave an overview of all the views of resurrection, and I interviewed one philosopher that gave like a physicalist account of the resurrection. Another one gave this emergent individuals account. Okay, my point in saying this is one of the people that I interviewed raised this worry when I told him that it was Trenton Merrick's. When I told Dr. Merrick's that I'd be interviewing someone on the resurrection by reassembly model, he looked shocked and was like, "There's still someone out there defending this view?" So I said, "Yeah, Justin Mooney," and he was like, "Oh, yeah." So this view kind of gets people bring it up and then they quickly dismiss it and are like, "Yep, there's many problems with this." So why don't we take a few minutes and lay out the most common objections that are raised to the resurrection by reassembly model?
Yeah. And there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of objections to it. But in the paper that we're talking about here, there's three big ones that I focus on. So let me just lay them out, all three of them, without trying to answer them yet. I'll just lay out the three objections, and then we can start seeing if they can be answered.
Yeah.
All right. So the first one is I call it the double resurrection problem. And this problem basically starts with the thought that, human beings take in and expel particles constantly. And so I'm made of different particles at different times. And in particular, it seems very likely that the particles I'm made of now are completely different from the particles I was made of when I was like 7 years old, for example. Two totally different groups of particles there. And so the double resurrection problem says this: suppose God takes all of the particles that composed St. Paul at the time when he died and puts them back together again, just the way they were when they composed Paul. Well, it seems like on the reassembly model, that's all it takes for that thing to be Paul, that reassembled person. But what if at the same time, God takes the particles that composed Paul when he was like 20 years old or something, and then puts those particles together exactly the way they were when they composed Paul? Well, again, it seems like that's all it takes for you to have Paul. And so now we have two Pauls somehow. And this seems like incoherent. One person can't be two people, you might think. And so what's going on here? It looks like the reassembly model has this absurd consequence. That's the double resurrection problem. All right, so that's problem number one. Here's problem number two that I want to think about a bit. It's called, or I call it at any rate, the cannibal problem. And this is like the classic objection to the reassembly model. And it has to do with particles being a part of more than one person. So suppose you've got a cannibal who eats a victim, and then the cannibal dies while still having some of the victim's particles incorporated into the cannibal's body through digestion. Okay, now we've got at least two individuals, both of whom had some of the same particles in their body at the point when they died. So what happens when God wants to resurrect everybody, including the cannibal and the victim? Where are those particles going to go? It seems like they need to be in the cannibal's body to reassemble the cannibal. They also need to be in the victim's body to reassemble the victim. But you might think, look, you can't have the particles be in two different bodies at once. So what do we do here? All right, that's the cannibal problem for the reassembly. And then the third problem that I talk about in this paper, I call the gap problem. And this goes back to like the second horn of Olson's dilemma. And here the idea is like, some people think, look, it does seem in the case of the watch that when you put the watch parts back together, intuitively that's the same watch. But a lot of people seem to have a different intuition in the case of reassembling a decomposed person. And they have the intuition that the reassembled person is not the original person. It's a different person. And this suggests that, well, it seems like there's a sense in which a person can't survive like a temporal gap in their existence. And so I call this the gap problem. And, Peter Van Inwagen has this really influential paper from 1978, I think, called The Possibility of Resurrection, where he makes this argument and he really pushes this intuition. Like, look, it's not going to be the same person when you put those particles back together again. It'll be a different person. And he has a suggestion about what is underlying that intuition. And his view is there's not the right kind of causal connection between the premortem person and the reassembled person. So that's one view about what's going on there. And that is the third problem for the reassembly view that I think about in this paper.
Okay, so we're going to go through each one of those, and you're going to explain how you've modified the reassembly model in such a way that it can meet these objections.
Yes.
But before we do that, I think now might be a good time. There's some people in the live chat, like Tim is asking, what is it exactly that's supposed to motivate that gap problem? Because he's thinking, well, I don't have that seeming. Like if you reassemble and it has the same parts, it does seem like the same thing. So what can you help motivate that, what people are saying when they say, it doesn't seem like the same thing?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so one thing to say, I suppose, is that it's definitely not automatically true that when you have parts arranged, the same parts arranged a certain way, they're going to compose the same object. And that's shown by the double resurrection problem, right? If I take the particles that composed Paul at the end of his life and assemble them in the Paul-like way, and the particles that composed Paul in the middle of his life and arrange them in a Paul-like way, and I could do this, or at any rate, God could do this, like multiple times. You could take the particles when he's 10 years old, when he's 7 years old, and you can get a whole bunch of Pauls, or at least things that are just like Paul and composed of the same parts. But at most, only one of them is actually Paul. So it's definitely not the case that automatically, anytime you take the parts that compose an object and put them together in the right way, you get that object. Okay. But you might think that, well, but in a case where there's not like multiple reassembly going on, then it would be the same object. And that's fine. I mean, maybe you don't have the kind of intuition that Van Inwagen tries to pump in that paper and that some other people have tried to. And maybe then you'll just think, well, this really isn't a problem. And that's fine with me. I mean, that's good for the reassembly view, that this problem isn't really a problem. But a lot of people do have this intuition. And even some people like, so there's a metaphysician named Ned Markosian who is an atheist and hasn't, as far as I know, really done any work on resurrection or anything, but on totally different grounds for unrelated reasons. He has this thought experiment where he imagines, like, suppose you have a person who lives in an eternal recurrence world. So in other words, every so many years, the very same history repeats itself. And so the very same particles come to be arranged in the very same way over and over again. And maybe it's like every 40 billion years, history repeats. And he thinks, look, intuitively, if I'm considering my sun, the next time those particles come together to compose someone just like my son, his intuition, and I share this intuition, is that's not my son. It's just a copy. It's like a perfect duplicate, but it doesn't seem like it would be the same individual. So anyway, I mean, maybe you have that intuition, maybe you don't. I do, so I'm worried about the problem. But if you don't, then that's one fewer problems for the reassembly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with the duplicate or the double resurrection problem. And yeah, explain how have you developed the resurrection by reassembly model in such a way that it can answer this problem?
Yeah, okay. So my strategy here is to say that there's actually a similar issue for a more popular theory of resurrection, and that the solutions to that problem for the more popular theory can be adapted to the reassembly model. And so it's no worse off than its more popular counterpart. So the more popular model is the falling elevator model, which was first proposed by Dean Zimmerman in a paper from 1999. And now there's I know of at least 4 other variations of it. One of which is Tim O'Connor's version, and you did an interview with Tim O'Connor. But anyway, so the falling elevator model, I'm not going to go into all the details about how it works, especially since you already did that one interview, but it has, as a part of it, a fission-like event, is the way I think Zimmerman or somebody describes as fission-like. Maybe it just is a fission event, where like at the end of life, a person kind of fissions into both a corpse and a resurrection body. And the defender of the falling elevator model needs to say what's going on in that sort of fission case. And so what Zimmerman does is he appeals to this theory proposed by Robert Nozick, which is called the closest continuer theory of identity, to make his version of the model work. And on the closest continuer theory, what happens in a case of fission is the fission product which is most similar to the original object is the original object. And if there's a tie, and there's just that both fission products are like equally similar to the original, then the original object just doesn't survive and you get 2 new objects. That's what happens on the closest continuer theory. And my thought is, well, look, okay, so the falling elevator model uses that, or at least Zimmerman's version of it does. Well, the reassembly theorist can use it to solve the double resurrection problem. They could say this: if God, reassembles a bunch of Paul-like objects out of particles that once composed Paul, either all of those objects are equally good candidates for being the original Paul, or they're not. If they are, then on the closest continuer theory, Paul just doesn't survive. And so in order to resurrect Paul, God has to make sure that God only makes one candidate and not a bunch of tied candidates, right? If there's, however, a best candidate among them, one that's more similar to the original Paul than the others, like the one that's made of the particles that composed him when he died, then on the closest continuer theory, that's going to be the original Paul. And so the idea here is the reassembly theorist can say, just reassembling particles that once composed Paul is not sufficient to bring back Paul. There's another condition, and that is it's got to be like the uniquely closest continuer as well. So that's one way to deal with it. Here's a second way. So O'Connor's version of the falling elevator model, which you did that interview about, he solves or handles the fission case by saying that objects have these things called emergent particular, or composite objects have these things called emergent particularities. And the way he describes them is, let's see if I can remember this, primitive, non-qualitative something components of an object, right? And so they're like these components of an object that are not the properties of the object, but rather the thing that the property is attached to. And the other thing, the part I couldn't remember, is that they're like unique, or well, at least one of the parts I couldn't remember, is they're unique to a particular object, right? So you have your emergent particularity, I have mine, and this is just like a metaphysical component of any object. And then he ends up saying, look, an object goes wherever its emergent particularity goes. And so it seems to me the reassembly theorist can also adopt this metaphysics if they want to. They can say, yeah, Paul has an emergent particularity, and reassembling the right particles in the right way is not sufficient to resurrect Paul. You also need the object that they compose to have Paul's emergent particularity. And at most, only one object composed of the right particles can have that particularity. And so whichever that one is, that will be the original St. Paul. Okay, so it seems to me then that the ways that falling elevator model people deal with fission-like problems can also be used to solve the double resurrection problem for the reassembly theorist. And so at least in this respect, the reassembly theorist is no worse off than the more popular, falling elevator model.
Mm-hmm. One thought I'll add here is, so for the sake of the paper that we're discussing, which by the way is linked in the description of the video, you assume materialism. But this particular problem, it seems to me, might be a little bit easier to answer if you assume something like substance dualism. My thought there is, say God brings back the body of 10-year-old Paul and 30-year-old Paul and whatever. It's whichever body becomes ensouled by Paul, like whichever wherever God puts Paul's soul, which body he puts it in, that one is now Paul.
Yeah.
And the others aren't Paul anymore.
Yeah, but the problem though, if you're one of those, if you're a substance dualist, right, then the version of the problem that you're going to be concerned with is identity of the body, not identity of the person. And so what you would have to say is that the key to making this body Paul's body is that it's hooked up to Paul's soul. Not the key to making this Paul, but the key to making it Paul's body is to have the right protector. And that, I mean, that definitely seems like a possible view. I could see somebody maybe defending that view. It's definitely, to me, not immediately obvious that that's the right way to give an account of identity conditions for bodies. It's like, well, what souls are they attached to? I would be more inclined to think that whatever goes for material objects in general, or at least like organisms or something like that, will go for bodies. And certainly, like, I don't think that every material object has a soul. But anyway, yeah, so that's a thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking you could say what makes it numerically the same is that it was all the particles, like all the same particles that in 10-year-old Paul, 30-year-old Paul, at one point they were all part of Paul's body.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they are Paul's body, but what makes it then Paul and not just a body of Paul is when his soul is joined with a particular body, then it seems like you can solve the duplicate problem. Like they're not. Yes. I may not be expressing it well, but
that's a way of solving. Yeah. Okay. So if the version of the duplicate problem that you're thinking about is which of these is Paul and not which of these is Paul's body, because those become two different questions if you're not doing the materialist version, right? Then yes, it becomes easy to solve the which of them is Paul question using the soul. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, but it seems like the substance dualist could say all of them are equally good candidates for Paul's body, or to be Paul's body.
Yeah.
I think that the substance dualist could say that. Yeah, they're all equally good candidates. And Paul will only survive if he, I should say, one of those bodies, I guess I want to say one of those bodies will only survive if his soul is joined to it.
Yeah, one of those,
like maybe like if his soul wasn't in it, then all you'd have is like a body,
a copy of the original.
A copy. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, you can do that. And I guess I'd still kind of have the same worry of like, well, I wouldn't want to say that in order for this phone to be the same phone tomorrow, it has to have the same soul. And so you'd have to be telling a slightly different story about bodies and their identity than other material objects. And that seems a little weird to me, but it's not complete. Like you could do that.
Yeah. Okay, I just mentioned that because I definitely lean more toward substance dualism than materialism. So,
yeah,
I'm thinking, how can the substance dualist achieve what might the substance dualist version of the story be? And I don't know. Resurrection by Reassembly seems like a nice story.
Yeah, well,
it's fairly intuitive to me.
Yeah, I think it's important then to say that a substance dualist, I think, can use both of the solutions that I gave. It's just that those are going to be the story they tell about the body, not about the person.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the second problem you raised, which was the cannibal problem. How can the resurrection by reassembly theorists respond to that problem?
Yeah, okay. So this was the problem of like, well, what happens if, cannibal eats somebody and then dies while they have some of that person's particles in their body. Now we have particles that need to be in two different bodies at the resurrection, both the cannibal and the victim. And this is actually a much more general problem. Like, so the classic way of presenting the problem is with cannibal cases. But there are other cases that generate the same problem of like shared particles between different people. So like Merrick's points out somewhere that, organ transplants can generate versions of this problem. Some people think that non-human animals are going to be resurrected, and as well as humans. And so if that's the case, then non-vegetarianism poses the same problem that cannibalism does. And then Eric Olson actually makes the point that, like, look, the longer history goes on, you're going to have more and more of the particles in the biosphere that were at some point part of some past person, until eventually you might get to the point where all of them were. And so any organism is going to be composed entirely of particles that used to be part of other organisms. And so the problem starts to get increasingly severe. And some solutions to it that would have otherwise worked won't anymore. Like solutions which say like, well, you don't need all of the original particles, but like most of them or something like that, right? Okay, so this is the cannibal problem. And I think there are at least two ways to solve the hardest versions of it. Maybe more, but at least two. And the one that is novel with me and that I end up defending in this paper actually ends up saying that, well, maybe you can have a single particle be in many bodies at once. And here's what motivates this idea. The idea of multi-location, or the thought that a material object can be in many places at once, is taken seriously in contemporary metaphysics. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that there are some pretty unambitious recombination principles that entail that multi-location is possible. And so some people think that's a pretty good reason to think that it really is possible. But also it does some theoretical work. It does some explanatory work in some areas. So for example, suppose you think that backward time travel is possible, at least metaphysically possible. Okay, now imagine that I travel back in time to visit my younger self. And you can imagine me like, shaking hands with my younger self. Well, what is going on there? You've got me shaking hands with me. Like what exactly? And there are different views about what's going on there, but one of the views that exists is that there's a single object, namely me, that is located in two places at once. Okay, and so then the thought is like, all right, suppose we grant that multi-location is possible, at least in principle. Well, then it seems like God could multi-locate an object whenever God feels like it. Why can't God just say, okay, well, now I want this particle to be located in all of these different places at once? It seems like God could just do that if God wanted to. And so the thought then is, here's how God can resurrect everybody, even if there are a bunch of particles that need to be in multiple bodies at once. God just multi-locates all of those particles. And there you go. We've got everybody resurrected despite the cannibal problem. So that's in a nutshell the solution that I propose to that problem.
That's a cool solution.
Yeah.
Maybe you said there's at least two, so maybe for the person that's like, yeah, multi-location is absurd.
Yeah.
What might you offer that person?
Yeah, no. Well, first, I definitely agree that it's a cool solution. Not, and I'm not saying this because it's my solution. I'm just multi-location is just cool. Like I've published a few papers on multi-location, or at least relevant to multi-location. I just think it's a really cool and fun idea. Um. Anyway. Yeah, and I had a mentor once who described like metaphysics having to do with things like multi-location as cool metaphysics. Okay. Oh, sorry. All right. So the other solution that I think works on even the hardest versions of this problem. This one I did not invent. In fact, David Hirshenov has published this solution somewhere, though I wasn't aware of that when I wrote the paper. And it is to say, well, you could just do a staggered resurrection. So if you've got like a particle that needs to be in two or more people, then God could just resurrect those people, but not all at once. You resurrect one of them, then take that particle out of them, perhaps through like just an ordinary process, like, breathing it out or excreting it or something, right? And then you move that particle over and you use it to resurrect the next person. And then that particle gradually works its way out of the body, and then the next person gets resurrected. So you could do a staggered resurrection. That's another way to deal with this problem.
All right. Let's go to the third problem, which is the gap problem. Yeah. So how does the reassembly theorist respond here?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you how this reassembly theorist responds. I don't know about other, if there are any other reassembly theorists. Anyway, yeah. So, okay. So what I do here is I take the reassembly model and like upgrade it to like from the naive version to a new version. And so my thought is this. I say, all right, suppose Van Inwagen is right, that the reason you can't just get the same person, but only get a copy by putting the particles back together again, is because there aren't the right sort of causal connections between the premortem body and the reassembled body. Well, then the natural thought to solve this problem is to just add the appropriate causal connections to the reassembly view. And I think there is a way to do that. The core idea that I've built this whole proposal on, by the way, I have reason to believe that it comes from Hudson originally. It definitely does not originate with me, though I don't think that Hudson has published it anywhere. But here's the core idea that I start with, and then I change it in some ways, which we're going to see. But I start with this. Suppose you've got an organism that has this really exotic but kind of cool power to just reassemble itself automatically if it gets taken apart. So imagine this organism gets like violently torn apart and, maybe even reduced down to particles. So it's like completely decomposed. But the particles, after they have been separated, just sort of automatically come back together. And they come back together exactly the way they were when the organism was decomposed. Now, and so this is just like a weird natural power we're imagining that this organism or the particles that it's made of have. Now, my intuition about this case is that the reassembled organism is numerically identical to the original. That's the same organism back again. That's my intuition about it. Maybe you share that intuition, maybe you don't. But suppose that intuition is right. Well, that suggests or at least one way of interpreting what's going on here is that we have gotten the right kind of causal connection back into the story for the original organism to come back. And it seems like that causal connection is something like this. The disassembly of the organism and the state that it was in right before that disassembly causes the reassembly, because it's because the organism was that way that the particles come back together in that way. And that causation is in some sense direct. It's not like, some outside agent is coming along and saying, oh, I'll put these particles back together and I'll model this on the way they were before. It's without the help of any outside force, so that the causal connections are in some sense internal to the organism and its parts or its particles or whatever. Okay, so
Yeah, to make the analogy to the watch, it would be like a watch that naturally reassembles itself.
Yeah, yeah. Where so
There
the
would just be some
watchmaker.
like law of nature or something that's like when this watch is taken apart, it just all the pieces come back together.
Yeah. And here's another analogy that is from fiction. There's an old kids movie. I'm trying to remember what it's called, about a big like iron robot who does this. Who like when he
Oh
breaks
yeah, the
apart,
Iron Giant?
the Iron Giant, yeah.
That's right, that's
When
right.
he breaks apart, after a little while, he like automatically the parts of him just like sort of magnetically move together and then reassemble.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that story, I think, actually supports the intuition that I'm trying to pump here, because we accept that in the story. We think, yeah, that's the same dude again. The same character is now back. So anyway, yeah, that's another example, which I considered including in the published paper, but ultimately did not, which might have been a mistake. I don't know.
I loved that movie, The Iron Giant.
It's
I
a,
need to go watch it again.
it is such a good movie. Yeah. Okay, I would totally watch that with you at some point.
Yeah, when we hang out, we'll do it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
okay,
Um,
so yeah, connect that with the resurrection by reassembly then.
yeah. Okay. So if that thought experiment seems to preserve the original organism, here's a way that resurrection by reassembly could work. That also would preserve the original organism. Suppose that people just had this natural power to automatically reassemble at some point after they had died and decomposed. Well, then, when that reassembly occurred, you'd have the right kinds of causal connections for the reassembled person to be the original person. Okay, now, I want to be clear, this is actually not the version of the reassembly view that I endorse. I actually don't particularly like that version of the story, and there's two big reasons why I don't like it. One thing I don't like about it is that the resurrection, like the automatic reassembly powers, seem kind of weird to me. It seems very like contrived, and I'm not real happy with that. The other thing I don't like about it is it actually doesn't really look like the traditional picture of resurrection, because it's not God resurrecting you. It's you just kind of automatically resurrecting by your own natural powers. And that is not what the traditional doctrine of resurrection says. So I actually don't like that version of the story, but I think there is another version of that story that gets around those problems. So here's the model that I actually am inclined to endorse. Suppose, the key idea that this uses is an idea from Dean Zimmerman that Hud Hudson has called a backtracking decree. So suppose that it's time for the resurrection to happen, and God is like, all right, I want to bring back St. Paul. So here's what God does. God issues the following decree, or something like the following decree. Let any particles that decomposed from St. Paul be arranged in a Paul-like way. Okay. Now notice something about that decree. That decree does not specify any particular individual particles. It just gives a general condition that some particles may or may not satisfy, right? It's not that God is looking and seeing that, oh, well, particles A, B, and C, and so on over here, those were the ones that decomposed from Paul, and then decreeing let A, B, C, etc. be arranged in a Paulic way. That's not what's happening here. Rather, God is just laying down this general condition. Let any particles which decomposed from St. Paul, reassemble or whatever. And so that decree will only have an effect if there are particles that meet that condition. If there are no particles that decomposed from St. Paul, then God, even if God issued that decree, nothing would happen, because it wouldn't apply to anything. Okay, now, this is important because it means that the decree doesn't by itself recreate St. Paul. It works together with the facts which are responsible for there being particles that meet the relevant condition. Too much all at once. Those changes have to be sufficiently gradual. And that fits just fine with the reassembly model, because when the person comes back into existence on the reassembly model, they're made of all of the same matter they were made of last time they existed, at their death. So there's definitely not a major material discontinuity there. But it's different when you come to the falling elevator model, because on the falling elevator model, the matter that a person is made of at the point of their death stays behind and makes up their corpse. Whereas the person jumps to the afterlife and is all of a sudden made of totally different matter. So there's a very huge material discontinuity there. And so that's a metaphysical commitment that the elevator model needs. Like, well, material continuity is not necessary for persistence, that the reassembly model doesn't. So that's one advantage. Here's a second advantage that I think that the reassembly model has over the falling elevator model. Some people have worried, and actually I'm one of the people who worries about this. I actually think this is the biggest problem with the falling elevator model. Some people have worried that on the falling elevator model, nobody really dies. And that would be a problem in part because if nobody really dies, then no one's really resurrected either. At least if that necessary condition I gave at the beginning on resurrection is a necessary condition on resurrection, right? So here's the thought. On the falling elevator model, a person sort of jumps out of their body, is the way it's sometimes put. They jump out of their body at the very last instant before they die, and then they just appear at the resurrection. And that's the very idea of like the falling elevator metaphor is precisely meant to get at that. Like the person steps out of the elevator just before it crashes, and so they don't end up dying in the falling elevator. And so the whole point of the model is that you don't really die. You actually leave one location in space-time to escape a death and then show up at another. And that sounds to me much more like a time travel journey or like a case of teleportation or something like that, rather than death followed by resurrection. So when the person shows up at the resurrection, it's not like that they've just come back to life. It's more like, no, they just got here from some point in the distant past, as if in a time machine or something. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that seems bad to me. And it's bad both theologically, because traditionally theology says people really do die and then really are resurrected. It's also bad if you are into like common sense metaphysics, which I am, because you have to say something very non-commonsensical, and that is nobody ever dies. Mm-hmm. That seems like a bad consequence for a theory, other things being equal. It would be nice to avoid that. So that I think is a really bad problem with the what's it called?
Falling elevator model.
Yeah, the falling elevator model. But it does not afflict the reassembly model that I've given, because on my model, the causal connections that stitch together the life of a person, if you follow those causal connections, they don't jump from the last moment of a person's life to the afterlife as they do on the falling elevator model. They go through the person's death and decomposition and then to the reassembly on resurrection day. And that's because of the way the decree is formulated, right? It's the particles that decomposed from St. Paul, not the particles that composed him at the last second that he was alive or something like that, right? And so that to me looks a lot more like the person actually dies and then is resurrected, rather than the person time travels to the resurrection or something like that. So anyway, yeah, that's another, I think.
I think that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really big advantage to me.
Yeah.
Your story actually incorporates the death of the person.
Yep.
The other one looks like they don't die. Okay. So we're going to go to Q&A now. We got maybe like 8 minutes. So if you've got a question for Justin, let's try to keep it on resurrection. Put it in the live chat. Just put the word question at the beginning. While you're doing that, please, if you've enjoyed the video, give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you've watched a bunch of my videos and you consistently find, hey, I learned so much from watching these videos, they've really helped me grow in my own understanding of Christian philosophy, then please consider becoming a patron. I would love to be able to spend more of my time creating content for the channel, and by you financially supporting me, it allows me to spend more of my time and focus more of my attention on the channel. So the link to become a patron is in the description. Just go click on it. And by becoming a patron, you actually get to become part of a private Facebook group. And you also get to participate in things like Ask a Scholar, where you can submit questions for scholars to answer. And you can also participate in the book club that meets once a month. So lots of good things going on if you just become a patron. So go become a patron. All right. I've got a question here from Kit Alcock. So Kit, good to see you, man. He says, thoughts on this argument. There's a
Sorites.
Say that.
Sorites.
Sorites series from no change between pre and post disassembly watch. Same parts and arrangement to lots of change between pre and post resurrection person. Different parts and arrangement. Suppose there's no sharp cutoff or vagueness in the sorites. Is that what you said?
Yeah, sorites, yeah.
Sorites series. Since watches can survive disassembly, it follows that persons can be resurrected. So yeah, break that down. Yeah. I don't know what a sorites series is.
Yeah, so a sorites series is like when you start with one it's a series of like gradual differences or changes that come in small increments, and where they can be, the differences between each step in the series can be arbitrarily small, so that at any given point, if you want to say that that property, stops being had, it seems like it seems wrong to say like, well, but the difference is so tiny. How could those two things differ in this respect? So here's the kind of here's the example that Kid is thinking of here. All right, so he's saying, look, if you put a watch together, or if you take a watch apart and you put it back together, you get the same watch again. Now imagine an object that's a little bit different from the watch, right? Like, let's just say, or actually, I guess what he's thinking is, now imagine we put the watch back together, but we change one part, right? And all right, well, one part, that's no big deal. That shouldn't make the difference between whether it's the same watch or not. So it is the same watch. Okay, well, suppose we change two parts. Well, if it was the same part when we just changed, or same watch when we just changed one part, surely two parts isn't going to make a difference between, this just, and so on and so forth, right? And then you can also talk about, and as Kit suggests, like, what if the parts are slightly differently arranged, and then slightly different again? And the problem is, it seems like there's no good place to say that there's a cutoff here. Like, oh, this time it's not similar enough to the original watch to be the original. Mm-hmm. And so we should just say that every time you reassemble something, no matter how different the parts are or how differently they're arranged, it's the same object again. I think that's what he's saying here.
Yeah.
And then what would be the upshot of this? That like you can reassemble a person using none of the same particles, arranged not at all in the same way, which seems like an absurd, consequence, right? I guess that would be the thought. And here, I mean, I suppose what I want to say, and this is something other people have said in other contexts where sorites puzzles come up, is like, well, we need some solution to the sorites puzzle in general. There are sorites puzzles all over the place. And so whatever you say about other sorites puzzles, you should just say the same thing here. Now, one thing you can say is you just embrace the apparently absurd consequence. And you say, okay, yeah, it turns out, even one object can be a heap. Because if you start with a big pile and you remove one at a time, like, yep, still a heap, still a heap. Removing one thing should not suddenly make it not a heap, right? And you end up with one. All right, so if you embrace these kind of crazy sounding conclusions of sorites arguments, then you should also just embrace that here. You're already committed to a bunch of crazy conclusions on the basis of sorites style reasoning, so it's not really going to be much worse to say that that's true here. On the other hand, you might have a way of avoiding those conclusions. You might think, no, there is a sharp cutoff somewhere, even though there's no particularly intuitive place to put it. And so then that's what you should say in this case, right? If you say that about heaps and other things, then you should say that about reassembly. Or you might think that there's metaphysical vagueness, like it can actually be indeterminate whether there's still a heap here, or whether these particles compose something, or whether, and it gets, so, and if you take that view, then say the same thing here, right? It's like indeterminate whether this is the same thing. Or in some cases, like, some people like semantic indecision. Like it's just a matter of our imprecise semantics that you get these puzzles. And that works well in some cases and not in others. And I'm not sure exactly. I guess this would be one of the cases where that doesn't seem like it works well, but still, whatever you say about the other cases where it doesn't work well, you should stay here. So, I mean, that's my thought about that.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last question. We're coming up on 1 hour. This is from Tim. Does your model assume that particles' history can be tracked? That it is possible to give a particle a name, X, and track the entire history of where X was?
I guess that depends on what exactly it means to track a particle's history. If we're talking like, is there some history you can give that says at any given time this is where the particle was? My understanding is that there are reasons from quantum mechanics to think that you can't do that. And I'm not sure that this model would require that. Now, there is one, I mean, this is one worry some people have about reassembly models is like, well, aren't there problems about identity of particles that arise from quantum mechanics? And, you know, I don't do a lot of philosophy of science. I have some colleagues who do and know a lot more about this sort of stuff. And actually, one day I should talk to them about what they think about this kind of thing. But yeah, this wasn't one of the problems that I dealt with in the paper. But yeah, I guess it's not obvious to me that you would have to be able to track the particle's history in that way. If what you mean is you can trace the path through space-time that the particle has taken through its entire career. Maybe you would need to do that, and that could be a problem if it's true, for the model, I mean. But I'm not sure yet if you would need to do that for this model to work. I mean, minimally, you need it to be the case that we can identify a particle at the time of resurrection with a particle at the time of that person's prior death. But that doesn't require that you be able to track the entire history of it, I guess, or at least it's not obvious to me that it requires that.
Mm-hmm. I guess one thought I had is your model that you sketched at the end requires that there be these kinds of like facts that exist about what these particles have done. Now, it's not the case that we have to be able, like humans have to like be able to know those facts. It might not even be the case that God has to know those facts. I'm not saying that, but I don't see how your model would say like God's got to know or something like that. It's just
right, yeah.
There is a fact of the matter.
Yeah.
Whether we or even God know it, there would be a fact of the matter about whether that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, I do know what you mean. So it's, you don't need like an epistemic condition here. You just need the metaphysics to be a certain way. It doesn't matter what anybody knows about the metaphysics. Now, that's still, my understanding, which is of quantum mechanics, is very limited, much more so than some of my colleagues who do like philosophy of science and things like that. But I think that even restricting it in that way and saying, well, we don't need all the facts to be known, we just need them to be the facts, there may be some problems here that would have to be worked out. But that's, I'll leave that to the philosophers of science.
All right, well, we'll end it there. Thanks so much, Justin. This was really good. And I will mention this. Go, if you want an overview of, I think we give 5 models of the resurrection, go check out my interview with Dr. Yang. And if you want to hear those models explored in more depth, then check out my interview with Trenton Merricks and Timothy O'Connor, as well as this one. Hopefully you've watched this whole interview. So that's going to be the little playlist that I'll put together on the doctrine of the general resurrection. All right. Thanks again, Justin. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.
See ya.